Yeah, thank you for the welcome and the applause, and for inviting us to present something on the climate and energy transition in Germany. And maybe to introduce ourselves a little bit more, Jenny, Annika, and myself, we're working at the Wuppertal Institute, and the Wuppertal Institute is a research institute in Germany, an independent think tank that is dedicated to really sustainability research, very applied research, not very much like a university, but a lot of policy advice. Annika is based in our headquarters in Wuppertal, and Jenny and I are based in our smaller office in Berlin. But obviously all of us are at home due to Corona. And unfortunately, none of it is in South Korea, which would be our total preference to give this lecture physically. What we would like to present to you is, I start with a short warm-up, but then Annika will walk you through the German emission reduction targets, the climate targets. And as you've heard in the previous presentation, the climate ambition in Europe is rising, and so are the German climate targets are also getting more ambitious, more stringent. And we're going to look at some sectors in a little bit more detail, and what I want to focus on will be the energy sector and questions of how the energy transition, specifically in the electricity sector, will be brought about, what kind of measures and what kind of challenges we see there. And then we're going to have a first set of questions of answers. So you have the possibility to raise questions, and please put them in the chat, and we'll have a look. And then in the second part of our presentation, we will take a closer look at climate neutrality, and you see that really going towards climate neutrality. Just a second. I thought my video was on. Is it on now?
Yes.
Okay, now you can see me. Good, that's better. The path towards climate neutrality, and you will see climate really becoming climate neutral is quite a challenge. We're going to explain one scenario a little bit in more detail, and then have an outlook of climate neutrality by 2050. Is that actually in line with the Paris Agreement? But before we go into that, I'll like to do a small warm-up, and I'll like to ask a question. This is the total energy supply of one country, and please put into the chat what your guess is. Which country would that be? You see the light blue in top is coal, then comes dark blue is natural gas. There's a fair amount of nuclear. The yellow thing is waste and renewables, and then there's oil at the bottom. And that could be difficult. Okay.
지금 채팅방에 답을 써주시면 되겠습니다.
Just a sec.
Can you see the answers, Timo?
Oh, yeah, good choices. All correct. All answers are fully correct. This is obviously South Korea. You've guessed right. And then my second question is very easy. If you look at the other country I've prepared, who would that be? What country? Please put it into the chat. And while you put perfectly correct answers into the chat, why I ask the question is that I must admit that embarrassingly, I have very little knowledge about South Korea, and in presenting, developing this presentation, I thought, okay, I have to look up some things, and what I find, because I find it very important when we talk about climate targets, is to have a feeling of what our two countries are like and what the similarities and differences are like. And if you look at the energy consumption, you see that the amount of energy consumption today is very similar between the targets. The types of energy supply is very similar, with coal, natural gas, nuclear, renewables, oils, with similar shares. But you see a very strong difference. And the big difference definitely is that while the energy supply in Germany has been flat or even declining slightly, the energy supply in South Korea has been increasing. And there's definitely several factors, like the economic growth has been stronger in South Korea. There is population growth in South Korea, while the population in Germany is pretty much flat. I've not looked into energy efficiency, but I think when we discuss our climate targets, and you need some sort of frame of what you hear now from my colleagues and me on Germany, it's probably good to have a little bit of a background of the similarities of our countries, both very industrialized countries, a lot of energy consuming countries, fairly wealthy countries in a global comparison. But on the other hand, there are stark differences, and those are the differences, or this is one of the differences that we see. Having said that, I would hand over to my colleague Annika to walk us through the emission reduction targets.
Thank you, Timon. Yeah, let's start by taking a look at the German government's current targets for reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. First, here you can see in red the annual German greenhouse gas emissions over the past 30 years. As you can see, there are some bumps, a few ups and downs, but overall, there's been a reduction of around 36%. And in 2019, Germany emitted roughly 450 million tons of CO2 equivalents, fewer greenhouse gases than we did in 1990. And that's obviously a good start and relates a lot to what Timon just said about German energy use and population and economic growth and everything. So now, over the past 15 years or so, the German government has been in the business of formulating emission reduction targets until mid-century, which you can see here in the green line. And the first target was actually for this past year. So it was to reduce emissions by 40% by the year 2020, as compared to 1990 as a base year. And this is then followed by targets to reduce emissions by 55% until 2030, then 70% by 2040, and finally the grand goal of climate neutrality by 2050. And a major milestone in German climate politics happened 2 years ago in 2019, when the goal of climate neutrality was actually signed into law. So this climate protection law, as we call it, also specifies concrete midterm goals for each emitting sector, which are annual reduction commitments. And unfortunately, a few years ago, the government coalition actually declared the 2020 target of 40% reduction to be unreachable. And while they would have certainly been right about this prediction, next slide, please. So they would have been right about this prediction if the German economy and with it key sources of greenhouse gases hadn't been slowed down by a global pandemic. So now from the looks of it, the 2020 target of 40% reduction was achieved after all. And these numbers are preliminary, but according to recent estimates, we reached a reduction of around 42%. And that we have to keep in mind that this is not really a victory of brilliant politics over the past few years, as much as it is, well, you could call it a faint silver lining on the horizon of a pretty bad year. And now the goal is a green economic recovery to ensure that this reduction that we've achieved isn't just temporary, but actually lays out the course for the new decade. And well, the 2030 target isn't far away now. So what does that mean exactly? What are the largest sources of emissions currently, and by how much do each of them need to be reduced to reach this goal? So here's an overview of current greenhouse gas emissions by sector in Germany. As you can see, the energy sector takes the largest slice of this undesirable pie at 35% of total emissions. And among other things, as you saw earlier, Germany still has a fairly large amount of coal and lignite in its energy mix, which are very emissions intensive. Germany also has a large energy intensive industry sector. So this produces, amongst other things, some basic materials such as steel or cement.
예를 들어서 철강이나 시멘트 그리고.
And so industry is the second largest emitter in Germany and is responsible for about 23% of emissions. And the third largest is transport at 19%, which includes, for example, the transport of goods, but also domestic flights and of course, passenger cars. We have a big car industry in Germany and our kind of, well, car country, you could call it, which doesn't make it very easy to reduce emissions in transport. And the remaining roughly 23% of emissions come from buildings with 14%, agriculture, which is mostly from livestock at 8%, and others such as waste with the remaining 1%. Next slide, please. So here we can see the development of annual emissions by sector since 1990. And you can see the energy sector, this is the bottom, the pink bars at the bottom, has continually emitted the largest portion of greenhouse gases, but it also is responsible for nearly half of the overall reduction that we have achieved so far. So this was accomplished through switching coal to gas and renewables, that among other things. And yeah, for the other sectors, this diagram is maybe a little difficult to interpret because it's all very small. So we summed it up on the next slide. So what you see here is a comparison for each sector of its 1990 emissions, its 2018 emissions, and the 2030 sector targets that are laid out in the climate protection law. So again, you can see that energy, which is on the left here, was responsible for a large proportion of already achieved reductions. We can also see that most other sectors have, at least proportionally, also achieved significant reductions. All except for one, the transport sector, which is fairly in the middle here, it has hardly changed its annual emissions at all since the year 1990. It's very insignificantly lower in 2018 than 30 years before. And this is due to several different reasons, including an increased number of flights, but also, as I said, the car industry is very powerful and important industry in Germany, and rollout of electric cars has been fairly slow here. And when we look at the 2030 targets, which are the light green columns for each sector, at first sight, it looks as though all sectors except for transport are well underway to achieving their respective targets. Most of them are at least halfway there. But of course, we need to consider that past reductions occurred over the course of 30 years, or 28. And the 2030 targets is now only a decade away. So this is just to give you an idea that these targets we have for the different sectors, the next interim target for 2030, they can be achieved, but they're definitely not a done deal, so to speak. And so, of course, the same goes for the overall 2030 target for all sectors. and subsequent targets for 2040 and 2050 that the German government has committed to. Yeah.
Okay, then I take over with a closer look at the energy sector, and you will find some similarities to what Alex presented in the previous presentation. First of all, maybe what the targets that Annika presented. What kind of challenges are this for the energy sector? It's this shift from fossil fuels to renewables that we need. We expect an increasing electricity demand because of increasing electrification, for example, in the transport sector, where electric cars are one of the ways of reducing emissions. And if you look at the chart with what our current policies are, we have support for renewables in the system, which basically aims at 9.7 gigawatt wind capacity. We have a coal phase-out plan for the year 2038, and we have a hydrogen strategy, which has about 10 gigawatt of hydrogen production by 2035. And we'll come back to those targets when we look at really the scenarios for zero carbon for a zero carbon economy. But I want to look a little bit more at some of the challenges that we're facing in those sectors. And the first sector I want to look at is coal and the electricity sector. And many people say, oh, the difficulty is bringing the renewables in and making storage and grid things, and a lot of technical issues on the energy supply side. And that is true, that is a challenge. But what we've been discussing over the last 5 years even more intensively is the question of jobs. And Alex in his presentation had mentioned that, that of course, the people who have been working in coal mining, the people who have been who lived in the coal regions that earned their income from coal, for them this shift to renewables is not a very good shift, and there has been strong protests and strong bargaining of trade unions and workers saying we cannot phase out coal that quickly because it's a question of jobs. I want to look at jobs in coal, and that is very interesting. On this graph, you see the number of jobs in coal, and if you just look at the line, that is the total number of direct employees in coal mining, people who work underground in the coal mines, but also the management, but only the coal companies, no one else. And in the late 1950s, there were 750,000 people employed in Germany in coal mining. So that's quite a lot. While today, there's less than 20,000 people. And the reason why that development happened is nothing had to do with climate targets. It's been a question of mechanization, more machines and less manual labor, more efficient mining. The question of, or the opportunity to use other energy sources like oil, gas, and also nuclear in Germany, reduce the need for coal. But also just the fact that coal in Germany is fairly expensive. It's very deep underground, and coal from the United States, from South Africa, from Australia and Colombia is cheaper. So we imported coal. So I find it very interesting that if you look at, we've gone down such a long way, and still, and it looks like it's a small number of jobs that are at stake, and still there is a lot of protest. This chart is also something Alex mentioned. This chart shows the employment of the energy sector in Germany overall, and what you see is that from 2000 to 2016, what this chart is, the employment of the energy sector the number of jobs in the energy sector has been going up. So basically, with renewables, and you see the blue bars at the bottom are the jobs in renewables. Because of the renewables, there's more jobs in the energy sector than there was 20 years ago. And this overcompensates the loss of jobs in the fossil fuel. But the problem is that, of course, it doesn't help the people in the coal regions very much if another region, for example, close to the shore where the wind farms are and the wind companies are, there is new jobs in wind farms and wind production, while they in their region lose their jobs. So we have had heavy struggles on this just transition issue and a lot of questions of how to compensate between regions. One thing that is often discussed is the question of, is it a cost question? And this is a curve not from Germany, but we could have similar charts from Germany. It's a cost of international costs of renewables. And I hope you see the gray bar at the bottom. That is the range of fossil fuel costs for electricity production from gas and coal. And then you see the different bars, the colorful bars, and the one in the middle, the reddish orange one is photovoltaics. And you see that 2010, 10 years ago, photovoltaics was about 4 times as expensive as electricity from coal and gas, while today it is pretty competitive. And same things can be said for wind. And it's not as much as a question of cost anymore as it was 10 years ago. And this is a big paradigm shift, in fact. So another and last issue is, if you look at the chart on the top left, that is the renewables, how they've, for electricity production, how they've increased. And there's a lot of wind and a lot of photovoltaics that has been built over the last 20 years in Germany. As I said, costs are less of a problem, but one of the problems is that there is local protests, especially against onshore wind, of people who do not want to have the site of wind farms very close to their house. And this is actually, if you look at, I don't know if you can see it, but if you look at the light blue chart, the amount of wind that was installed over the last years really flattened. We have very little wind installation rates over the last year. Having said that, yeah, we would come to questions and answers in the first break, and I see there's some questions in the.
그래서 이미 채팅창에 질문이
Yuan, if you could help out here.
주시겠습니까?
네, 질문들을 그러면 위부터 읽도록 하겠습니다. 맨 위에 영어로 써진 질문은 잘못 남기신 거라고 알려주셔서 그 다음 질문 한국어로 써 있는 것부터 읽겠습니다. 굉장히 긴 질문인데요. 최근 유럽이 신재생 에너지의 발전 비율을 늘려 전기세에 대한 국민들의 부담이 있을 것 같습니다. 앞으로 한국 또한 이와 같은 상황에 처할 텐데 현재 유럽과 독일에서 국민들에게 전기세 부담을 덜어주기 위해 어떤 제도가 시행되고 있는지 궁금합니다. 특히 어떻게 그 높은 전기세에 대한 취약계층의 부담을 덜 수 있는지 궁금합니다. 다음 질문들을 계속해서 읽어도 될까요? 아니면 이 질문에 먼저 답변하시겠습니까?
Yeah. Anika and Jenny, I'll take that answer if you're okay. It's true. The electricity prices have gone up because of the support for renewables, but in fact, depending on how you calculate it, the increase in electricity prices has been fairly small because of the renewables. There were other factors that are more important. Gas became more expensive. Taxes in general have gone up. What you see on this chart, this is why I put it in, we've had 2011, 2013. This was at a time where we had a strong installation of renewables, especially photovoltaics. And if you look, and this is just the chart that I showed before, if you look at the cost of photovoltaics 10 years ago, then the photovoltaics were very expensive. And you may know that Germany has a feed-in tariff, so basically the costs are spread among all consumers. So that means we're today still paying for those expensive photovoltaic power plants that we built 10 years ago. The photovoltaic plants we would build today, they would be much cheaper, and actually they would not increase the costs by large. The interesting thing is when you talk about compensation, there is very little debate about electricity for costs for poorer people, because the electricity costs for the household are not a strong factor. It is for some very poor people, but in general, heating costs are more important. German winters are very cold. Transport costs are very important. And the electricity costs are very important for the energy-intensive industries. And actually, the only support mechanism that is in place with respect to electricity prices and renewables is in the energy-intensive industry, like aluminum smelters, like chemical industry, and the like.
네, 그러면 다음 질문 읽어드리도록 하겠습니다. 조금 넘어가세요. 독일이 재생에너지로의 전환을 빠르게 이루고 있으나 부족한 전력을 인근 국가로부터 수입함으로써 그 비율을 유지하고 있다고 들은 적이 있습니다. 빠른 전환도 중요하지만 감당할 수 있는 속도로 발전해야 한다고 생각하는데 이에 대해 어떻게 보시나요?
Yeah, good point, but interestingly.
네, 좋은 점을 지적해 주셨습니다. 그런데 흥미롭게도 사실은 거꾸로입니다. 지금 상황이요. 지금 차트를 갖고 있지는 못한데 나중에 보내드릴 수 있을 것 같은데요. 독일 같은 경우에는 전력 수출 물량이 지난 20년 동안 오히려 늘어났습니다. 그래서 현재 독일은요, 전력 수출을 전체 발전량의 10%를 이웃국에다가 수출하고 있습니다. 이거에 대한 경제성을 따져보게 되면요, 그러니까 재생에너지가 있고, 그리고 대형 전력회사, 발전회사들이 뭐 이제 화석연료 기반의 이러한 발전소들을 폐쇄하고 싶어하지 않아 하기 때문에 태양열이나 혹은 풍력과 관련해서 이 발생하는 많은 에너지들을 오히려 이웃국에 수출하고 있다라고 하겠습니다. 더 많이 수출량이 늘어났습니다. 그래서 거꾸로의 상황이라고 보시면 되겠고요. 물론 이제 독일의 상황은 한국하고는 굉장히 많이 다릅니다. 그래서 독일 같은 경우에는 사실 이제 저희 모든 국경마다 다 EU 회원국들과 연접하고 있죠. 그래서 유럽연합의 의도도 뭐냐면은 강력한 그런 모든 물품에 대해서 전력을 포함한 모든 물품에 대해서 강력한 교역을 하도록 하는 것입니다. 그러니까 전력 자체가 워낙 많이 교류가 되고 그래서 가장 저렴하게 발전을 할 수 있는 국가가 이제 공급을 하는 것이죠. 그래서 오스트리아나 노르웨이, 스웨덴 같은 경우 보시면 수력 발전이 풍부하고 뭐 임업에 대한 자원들이 풍부하기 때문에 독일의 이제 전력이 부족하게 될 경우에 이쪽에서 제공을 하게 되고 또 저희 같은 경우도 풍력이나 일조량을 이용한 많은 재생에너지가 발전하게 되면 이것을 또 다른 나라들에게 제공을 하게 되는 겁니다. 물론 한국하고는 좀 상황이 다른 걸로 알고 있습니다.
Okay, the next question. This one is in English, so I will directly read it in English. Okay, how did people's interest in Green Deal change after the crisis of COVID-19 occurred?
I don't know. I give a brief intro, and maybe Jenny and Annika can add, because I think we have to distinguish between an expert discussion and the regular people, because for the regular people, my impression was climate issues were less important this year. Last year, there was a lot of, last year meaning 2019, there was a lot of interest in climate issues. There was Fridays for Future protests very strongly in Germany, and all that has gone down with the COVID situation. But if you look at experts like politicians, associations, industry, and they continue with climate mitigation despite the COVID pandemic. And actually, a lot of the money that is used, is supposed to be used to bring up the economy, should support climate mitigation. And I think that is a way where actually we've been trying to learn from South Korea, because we did not do this in the first, in 10 years ago in the financial crisis, where a lot of European countries have put their economic support programs in old sectors, while South Korea has strongly invested in new sectors and clean sectors. So we're trying to do better this time.
네, 중간 질문을 더 진행해도 된다면 지금까지 나온 거를 다 다루진 않고 좀 겹치는 것을 하나 모아서 전달한 후에 다음 파트 진행하면 좋을 것 같습니다. 네, 독일 탄광 노동자들의 직업 전환 관련 질문이 많이 나왔는데요. 직업 전환을 위한 방안이 따로 있는지, 그리고 지역별로 동독에 석탄 공장들이 몰려 있고 이와 관련된 위원회를 형성했다는 얘기를 들었는데 어떤 과정으로 탈석탄을 유도할 수 있었는지 궁금합니다.
Yeah, interesting question.
네, 흥미로운 질문 감사드립니다.
You know much more about Germany than I do about South Korea, and than I expected. So we could go very much into detail, and Jenny and I have been working quite a bit on coal miners and the structural change issues. There is a lot of social security and social benefits and programs for miners and people who lose their jobs and get unemployed in Germany in general, if you compare this to global standards or other countries. There has been funding for those people who lose their job, but actually this is not the really important thing. If you look, Annika presented this, well, no, it was on my slide. The plan for now is to phase out coal by 2038. If you look at how old the people are who work in the mines, 2/3 of them are over 45. So in 20 years, most of them will actually retire anyhow. So the people who work in the mines, for them, it's less of a problem. The bigger problem is for the region where the whole economy is, the indirect jobs, the tax incomes. And there has been strong compensation schemes, and this could be a talk on its own, where I think it has a lot to do not only with the economic situation of the coal mining, but of the whole reunification of Germany, where East Germany is still economically much weaker than West Germany, and we're still compensating for that reunification. And we're discussing it as a climate issue, but it's a justice issue that goes much beyond energy and climate policy. I don't know how many questions there are, but I feel I'm talking too much and would like to give Jenny and Annika time to present. So I don't know, can we move on, or is there very important questions you want to raise now? Maybe we can raise some after the second part of the presentation.
Sure, we could move on.
then I would hand over to Jenny.
Yeah, thank you, Timon. Okay, so now let's come to the third part of our presentation, the path towards climate neutrality. First, we will see that Germany has increased its climate ambitions in the last years, so that are good news. And then we will have a look at one possible scenario, how climate neutrality can be achieved by 2015. So, Annika already presented to you Germany's current climate goals, which include the country becoming climate neutral by 2050. However, this is a relatively new development. As recently as 2016, Germany's climate protection plan aimed for -80 to -95% reduction by 2050. Okay, speak louder. Okay, I will just put the computer a bit closer to me. Please wait a moment. Sorry for this.
Thank you very much. If you could speak closer to the microphone.
Yes, okay.
Okay,
is it better now for you?
Actually, can you speak closer? It seems that your voice is very far out in the distance.
Okay, now I'm really close to my computer.
Okay.
It's still not better. Okay.
Maybe I could just adjust my volume level. Can you please wait?
Okay, so is it better now?
Yes, it's gotten better. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, and sorry for that. Okay, let's go on. Okay, as you see here, climate neutrality is a relatively new development. Tina, next slide, please. In response to the Paris Agreement, Germany increased its long-term climate goal, which you can see on this.
장기적인 목표를 설정하였고 계획도 마련하였습니다. 그래프에서 보시는 것처럼
-95% reduction and climate neutrality. It seems to be quite a small difference, but that's not the case, as we will see later. And one point we see at this graph is that while Germany has increased its climate targets for 2050, the interim targets for 2030 and 2040 were not revised yet. And this is difficult for two reasons. First, it does not seem so smart to take 20 years to go from -40 to -70% and then reduce the last 30% in just 10 years. That seems to be quite difficult. And second, it's not just when a country becomes climate neutral that matters, but how many emissions are emitted by then. So if the interim targets are not adjusted, too many emissions will be emitted on the way to climate neutrality. But next slide, please. As you know, climate policy
보시는 것처럼
is also shaped by the European Union. You've probably heard that in this section before. And the European Union raised its 2030 target to -55% as part of the Green Deal. For Germany, this would imply raising the national 2030 target to -65%. And since the European climate targets are mandatory for its member states, Germany will have to follow Brussels here sooner or later. Okay, so this was about raising Germany's ambition. And now we will have a look at a concrete scenario that shows how Germany can become climate neutral. Before we do this, I would like to say some words about scenarios in general. It's important to understand that scenarios are not a prediction of the future, nor are they necessarily linked to political commitment. What scenarios can offer is a description of possible future pathways, Thus, they can be used as a tool to understand challenges and options of how to reach a target better. So in our case, scenarios can answer the questions, what does a climate neutral Germany look like? And how do we get there? Next slide, please. For Germany and the European Union, there are a number of existing scenario studies that show different development towards a low carbon future. These scenarios differ, for example, in terms of their level of ambition or the extent to which they assume consumption and lifestyle changes. A recent scenario study that has received a lot of attention was commissioned by the German think tank Agora Energiewende. You can see the cover here. And this study explores a scenario which reaches climate neutrality by 2050, considers current targets and political developments at national and EU scale, and explores all key sectors under the German climate protection law. The scenario describes itself as progressive as necessary and as conservative as possible. Progressive means that the scenario considers an increased 2030 target of minus 65%. And conservative means, for example, that the scenario does not consider radical changes in lifestyles. So how do we get to climate neutrality by 2050? According to the Agora scenario, in the first phase, the 2030 target is raised to minus 65%, triggered by dynamic at European level. And as you can see here, all sectors contribute to reaching it. The numbers you can see here indicate million tons CO2 equivalents. The reduction targets vary across sectors. This is since it's harder to realize some measures than others. And the greatest potential are in the energy sector, followed by the transport and the industry sector. Since we cannot go in detail through every sector, let's have a closer look at the energy and the transport sector. So in the energy sector, the reduction is mainly achieved by an accelerated phase out of coal and the increased expansion of renewable capacity in electricity generation. So this scenario assumes that coal is phased out by 2030 instead of 2038. And the study assumed that this will largely occur due to changing market conditions for coal-fired power plants. Because with the increased EU reduction targets, the price for CO2 certificates within the European emission trading system will also rise. And this will make coal-fired power plants less competitive. However, since Germany just decided to phase out coal in 38, this might be quite a discussion to accelerate the coal phase out now. But as we see here, if we are taking climate neutrality and the European New Deal seriously, it may mean that the decision for a coal phase out in 2038 may be too late. And so according to the scenario, while coal is phased out quickly, renewable energies generate about 30% of gross electricity consumption. And for Germany, the most important renewable energy sources are solar energy, wind onshore, and wind offshore. In addition to that, the energy sector has to start to provide green hydrogen, mainly for the industry sector. Okay, so these are the challenges in the energy sector. Let's look at the transport sector. Annika has explained that this sector hasn't achieved any reduction so far. So we definitely need a change in current trends here. People use public transport, cycle or walk significantly more than today. And the share of electric cars will significantly rise. Freight trains instead of trucks will be used to transport a larger volume of goods. And 1/3 of the remaining road freight kilometers will be covered by electric trucks powered by batteries, overhead lines, and fuel cells. Okay, so this is a first look at what could be done in order to reach the 2030 target in line with the Green New Deal. Then let's look at the second phase from 2030 to 2050. Here we will see in this phase, the emissions should be reduced by 95%. As before, all sectors contribute, and in general, electrification will continue across all sectors, and hydrogen will become increasingly important. When we look at the energy sector again, this means, first of all, that power generation must be 100% renewable. All fossil fuels will be replaced by renewable electricity or hydrogen and synthetic fuels. And these are, of course, also produced with green electricity. Okay, and the transport sector, here the strategies we have seen until 2030 are reinforced. The public transport as well as shared vehicle use via carpooling will increase capacity. Almost all remaining cars are electric, and more goods will be transported by rail. The remaining trucks are powered by batteries, overhead lines, and fuel cells. And air transport and shipping will be powered entirely by electricity-based synthetic fuels. Okay, so this was the second phase. But what will happen then? Let's have a look at the next slide. So now we reached the year 2015 and 62 million tons of annual greenhouse gas emissions still remain according to our scenario. Where do these emissions come from? As you can see here, the biggest chunk comes from agriculture. Emissions arise through fertilizers and by animal husbandry. So as long as cattle continue to be kept, methane emissions in agriculture cannot be completely avoided. And some emissions also exist in industrial processes. According to current knowledge, not all process-related emissions in industry can be avoided. And this applies particularly in cement, lime, and glass industry. By contrast, we can see here very well that energy-related greenhouse gas emissions can be almost completely eliminated by using renewable energy sources. And this is really important to understand. Earlier, I announced that we will see that there is really a big difference between -80 and -95 and -100% reduction. And when we aim for -95% reduction in contrast to 80%, there are definitely no fossil fuels in our energy system anymore. No natural gas, no coal, no oil. And when we aim for -100% reduction, there are mainly two options. We can either radically change our lifestyles and consume very, very few animal products anymore. Then the remaining emissions could probably be compensated by strengthening natural CO2 sinks, such as forests and moors. Or we can try to compensate the remaining CO2 emissions by carbon capture and storage, in short, CCS. This means to capture CO2 from the air or from the combustion of biomass and to storage it, for example, under the seabed. The problem of both options is that at least in Germany, they're both not that popular, and the CCS technology is not yet fully mature. But since it seems to be more realistic to achieve a sufficient acceptance for CCS than to radically change nutrition habits, This scenario I presented here works with CCS, as you can see here. So they are reaching net zero by negative emissions. Okay. As a short reminder, what I just presented to you is a scientific scenario that shows one way how Germany can reduce its emissions and become climate neutral. These are not yet adopted policy measures. And if we compare current policy with this scenario, we see that, for example, current regulation on the transformation of the energy sector is likely insufficient for reaching German and EU climate goals. For example, the expansion of wind and solar energy and the production of hydrogen must be significantly increased. And as we have seen before, the coal phase out should be accelerated. Okay, this was a short look at possible pathways towards climate neutrality. Then I think it's Annika's turn.
Yes, thank you. All right, so now we have looked at what the government's current targets and supporting policies are, and we've looked at a scenario that follows these targets and reaches climate neutrality by 2050. But to finish up, we wanted to raise another question. So let's take a step back and ask, are these targets even sufficient? So a lot of the rhetoric around the Paris Agreement in Germany and other countries suggests that becoming climate neutral by 2050 is synonymous with honoring the Paris Agreement. But is this really true? Next slide, please. So just, I'm sure you're all aware, but just to remind us all, the key goal of the Paris Agreement is holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, recognizing that this, so limiting it to 1.5, would significantly reduce the risks and impacts of climate change. So remembering that the Paris Agreement is a contract between countries that is binding under international law, I think it's worth considering whether our national climate targets are actually in line with pursuing efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And there are many things to consider when deciding what is fair, which countries should contribute how much to these shared efforts of reaching 1.5. And that is a whole other debate about morals and ethics that I don't think we can get into today. But so there's the German Council of Experts on Environmental Issues, which is basically just a high-level group of experts that advises the German government. They did some very basic calculations about what would be a fair contribution towards the Paris Agreement. And this calculation suggests that the government's current targets are not actually a fair contribution to the 1.5 degree goal. Next slide, please. So what they did, this Council of Experts, was basically to assume that every person on this planet who was alive at the time of signing the Paris Agreement had the same equal right to emit the same amount of greenhouse gases until the 1.5 degree limit is likely reached. So as Jenny said earlier, when she talked about making the targets more ambitious, it doesn't really matter at what point we reach climate neutrality. Doesn't matter to the climate anyway, but it matters how much we emit until that point. So there's a carbon budget that we all have to stick to, and that doesn't care about any borders or which country deserves to emit how much. So we have to stick to that. And if we want to keep it simple, we can just assume that every person has the same right to emit whatever we can still emit until we reach 1.5 degrees. And so if we take that assumption, which we did, and then estimate that in this case, the German energy system, including everything we looked at before, so industry, transport, buildings, the energy sector, this whole system would have to become carbon neutral in the first half of the 2030s. So that would imply around 2035 at the latest, which is quite a bit earlier than 2050, you could say. So we did a study for Fridays for Future Germany, in which we explored what this would roughly entail to have an energy system that becomes carbon neutral by 2035. And so we have this nice little table again here, which looks at the energy sector, and the numbers are quite striking. You can see here the comparison again with the current targets and with the 2050 Agora scenario that Jenny explained. And because everything would have to be accomplished in about half the time if we start in 2020, this is 15 years rather than 30, right? So we would have to be much more ambitious. And this is just the example of the energy sector. You can imagine similar policies for the other sectors that would have to be adopted. And for the energy sector, it means installing at least around 25 to 30 gigawatts of new renewable capacity every year, which is compared to the almost 10 that current policy implies and the 15.5 from the Agora scenario. It is quite a lot more, so up to 3 times more than what current policy implies. Yeah, so the second part, obviously, the coal phase out, 38 is too late if by 35 we want to be carbon neutral. We didn't calculate a specific year, but it would definitely have to be well in advance of that. So 2030, perhaps earlier, would be necessary, which with current debates seems a bit tricky. Lastly, it means installing 70 to 90 gigawatts of electrolyzer capacity by 2035, which is 7 to 9 times as much as the maximum installation that current policy foresees. So yeah, this is just to give you an idea of what current targets imply, and we're not saying that this is the definitive way to go. We took an assumption of equal right to emission, and we thought it through and thought about what this would entail, and see that we could be more ambitious than we are right now if we take this this assumption. And yeah, so it's always worth questioning current goals and asking if they're enough. Obviously, how we can achieve them, but also should they be raised and by how much? So to summarize, we can say that climate targets in Germany are being revised, which is good. They will become more ambitious as time goes by and have been in the past. And increasing targets on EU level also lead to more ambitious targets in Germany, which is a nice added pressure there. And then for different sectors, we have electricity, which has already achieved the best reductions compared to the other sectors, but currently, due to a lot of the issues that Timon explained earlier, renewables installation rates are way too low, and coal phase out, while it has been decided, is too late, even for the 2050 goal. In transport, it's very difficult because of the high importance of the car industry. And in the industry sector, there has been a change of paradigm. So while there were low achievements over the last decade, now the rhetoric of the industry has changed, and carbon neutrality by 2050 is becoming a more established target with different companies and different industries. And yeah, lastly, the right framework conditions are, of course, important. We need ambitious long-term targets. We need carbon pricing that is effective. And of course, a slew of other policies need to be adopted. And yeah, that is it. Thank you very much for your attention. And I think we're going for some more questions now.
네, 이제 질의응답 시간을 갖는 게 맞습니까? 시간이 더 남았습니까?
네, 지금 현재 약 10분 정도 시간이 남았는데요. 저희가 사전에 또 이 강의를 위해서 받은 질문들이 있어서 그 중에서 최대한 조금 비슷한 것들을 모아서 지금 질문 드리려 합니다. 네, 우선 먼저 질문 한국어로 읽겠습니다. 독일 에너지 전환 과정에서 전기요금이 인상되면서 전기를 직접 생산하는 프로슈머들이 늘어났을 것 같습니다. 전기 소비자 이탈로 인해 전력 회사들이 손실을 본 사례가 있는지 궁금합니다. 이게 한 가지고요. 또 연결되는 것으로 전기요금의 인상으로 인해서 소비자 물가가 올라간 그런 변화 사례가 있었는지 궁금합니다.
Who wants to go of us?
I didn't really hear the first part of the question due to internet issues, so maybe one of you two could answer.
Timon, please go. I didn't really get the question because it was...
Yeah, there has been a lot of debate also on electricity prices for renewables, and but basically, if you look at other price drivers, there are other things that are important. And I'm sorry, I keep repeating myself a little bit on this. Inflation in Germany has, over the last 10 years, been extremely low. There's basically no inflation rate. And if you look at which parts of the energy system drive the inflation, then it's basically oil for cars, fuel, and it's gas, where the gas price is linked to the oil price for heating in winter, and part of the electricity. The driver of renewables is very limited, but there has been a strong debate, and that has. In my view, it's a little bit of an outdated debate because it's in a debate of we had 7-8 years ago when the renewable prices were quite high, and we're still paying those costs, but it's basically costs of technology development for technologies which 10 years, 20 years ago were not very mature, but now are becoming more and more mature. There is a more complex debate on, well, if we bring in more electricity now, more renewables now, we are at a renewable rate of little below 50%. In the first half of 2020, we were actually over 50% because the electricity consumption was low due to the pandemic. And we had a very sunny and very windy spring, a beautiful time for renewables. And now all the more renewables we bring in, the more money we need to spend for either grids that need to be electricity grid that need to be extensified, or questions of storage becoming more and more important. But the renewables as such are so cheap, so to speak, that they can compete with new coal and gas fired power plants.
있습니다.
네, 감사합니다. 그러면 다음 질문 말씀드리겠습니다. 재생에너지 확대에 따라서 전력망 설비도 같이 확대가 되는데요. 이런 전력망 설비 확대에 따라서 주민들의 반발이 있을 경우 어떤 식으로 독일은 해결했는지 궁금합니다. 한국의 경우 이런 반발들과 관련해서 재생에너지 입지 규제 등도 생기는데요. 이런 것에 대해서 주민과의 갈등을 어떻게 풀어갔는지 알려주시면 감사하겠습니다.
I'm not sure if I understood the question correctly due
예.
to the connection. Was it about local opposition to renewables?
반발에 대한 질문이 맞으신가요?
네, 지역사회의 갈등, 반발에 대한 질문이 맞습니다. 단순히 재생에너지 설비의 확대에 따른 반발뿐 아니라 이에 따른 전력망 설비 확대에 따른 반발도 같이 질문드렸습니다.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is quite a bit of debate.
네, 이 부분 관련해서 조금
There's two sides. If you look 15 years ago, Germany has promoted the renewables very strongly. And one thing that was, in my view, done very well was that the way the incentives were done for the renewables, it was taken care that the local communities profit from the renewables. For example, Germany changed its tax law so that the taxation of renewable power, for example, wind farms, is not where the owner of the wind farm lives, but it's where the wind farm is physically based. And Germany, just for this, changed a part of its tax law, so that a very rural community, a small town, where a wind farm is built, gets tax income if there is a wind farm. That, in the beginning, ensured a lot of support for the renewables, especially in the rural areas, because the farmers and the rural communities had new sources of income. Now, with more and more wind, especially, there's more opposition, and you mentioned also grid extension. There's a lot of thing. It's a difficult balance between. There is, of course, the idea of it's supposed to be a democratic process, and you want to ask local communities, and you want to bring them in a participatory planning process. On the other hand, there are a few voices that are very loud and that slow down the process. And Germany has not made good progress, for example, in extending its electricity grid, which is very difficult. So it's a challenge we're facing, and I don't think we have a good solution for it.
One more point to this. I hope you can hear me now. One thing the German government did in order to reduce this conflict is that they increased the necessary distance between a windmill and a house. So now there really has to be a large distance between the place the windmill is going to be and the place where people are living. And in one way, we can think that this is a good point because so the resistance against new wind energy may be a bit less, but on the other hand, it gets more and more difficult to build these windmills because yeah, everywhere are houses, and since the distance has to be so big, there's not much space left.
네, 시간이 거의 다 됐는데요. 혹시 그러면은 지금 이 자리에서 바로 질문해 주실 분이 있으시면 혹시 손을 들고 마지막 한 질문만 받아보도록 하겠습니다. 지금 한 2분 정도 남아서요. 만약 이 질문을 꼭 정말 여기서 듣고 싶다 하시는 게 있으시면 지금 바로 손을 들어주시면 감사하겠습니다. 네, 오지형님 기획단 분은 후순위로 드리려 하는데요. 다른 분들이 없으시면 네, 다른 분 없으셔서 지형님 질문 드리겠습니다. 바로 직접 음소거 끄시고 말씀해 주시면 되겠습니다. 한국말로 하시지 않고 만약 영어로 하실 거면 채널을 변경하셔야 됩니다. 지형님.
네네, 채널 변경은 어떻게 하나요?
영어로 말씀하실 건가요? 네, 잠시 채널 변경하느라 시간이 잠시 걸리고 있습니다. 양해 부탁드립니다.
네, 잠깐 지연이 됐는데요. 제가 질문 지금 바로 드리겠습니다. 한국이 이제 지금까지 세워온 온실가스
Korea so far has come up with a lot of plans, and some of them have been overturned, and they have.
면 사실 저희가 약간 공허한 뭐 2050년 넷제로에 대한 얘기나 아니면 장기적인 계획만으로는 우리가 기후 위기를 해결할 수 없다는 것이 좀 분명하다고 생각을 하는데요. 그렇다면 이제 독일이 사실 좀 정당 간 합의를 이루고 좀 합의를 한번 이루면 그거를 계속 실제로 실현시키는데 약간 그러한 이제 정치적 분화가 있는 것으로 알고 있는데 가장 효과적인 이제 법적이나 아니면 정책 관련된 그 제도들을 어떤 걸로 꼽을 수 있을지 궁금합니다. 그래서 이제 정부가 이제 내세운 정책들이 실제로 실현되는 과정에서 어떤 요인들이 필요한지 그런 것들을 말씀해 주시면 감사하겠습니다.
What are the factors that you need to have in place? So what is really required to actually ensure the implementation of the plans?
Okay, maybe I start and then Annika and Jenny can add. First of all, I'm not so sure if Germany is actually that good in implementing our plans. We like to show globally that we're the good climate protectors, and in some things we did make achievements. On the other hand, I think sometimes we're better at promoting our what we do than what we actually do. And having that said, I can flip back in a second. If you look at our climate targets, basically between 2010 and 2016, our CO2 emissions have not been going down, and that was a long phase in Germany where, despite all the efforts we've made, we did not get closer to our targets. And now over the last 2-3 years, there has been an increasing, or maybe 5 years, there has been an increasing climate debate, and the general public, some interest groups, science and NGOs have been pushing the politicians to really come up with more appropriate measures. But it has been ups and downs. And as Annika and Jenny pointed out, transport is a tough issue where we're still lacking things. Renewables were great in the past, but are now so-so, and we need to speed up. So despite all the good things that have been achieved, I do see a lot of deficits. And then, of course, we would now go into details of very specific measures of energy efficiency for buildings, for cars, for industry, what exactly worked and what works harder. Then we have a very detailed discussion that is probably beyond the time scope of this thing. But I just want to be cautioning that not everything is as great as it may seem from the distance.
I would like to add to that. So in 2019, as I said earlier, the climate protection law was adopted, and I think this is still fairly new.
Before that, we had climate protection plans, which are not laws. And well, I think there is some hope that the fact that this has been signed into law, rather than just being the proclaimed goal of whoever is currently governing the country, will help bring the necessary changes and pressure about. And the fact that it also has binding sectoral interim targets, I think, is promising. And well, that could be a way to get the different ministries responsible for the different sectors to implement strategies and policies to achieve these targets. And another thing to add to that is that the fact that climate neutrality has been signed into law was likely very much influenced by the Fridays for Future protest movement, which was very strong in 2019. And since they were then negotiating this law, the influence of the protest movement was definitely palpable there. That just to end on a more hopeful note, although I do definitely agree with Timon that Germany is quite good at acting the big climate protector versus actually achieving the targets that we set up. But hopefully we'll see in the future, maybe this will change and we won't just reduce our emissions because there's a pandemic, but because of good policy.
라고 있어서는 안 될 것이고요. 좋은 정책의 결과로서 있어야 될 것입니다. 감사합니다.
네, 감사합니다. 벌써 시간이 많이 지났기 때문에 오늘 강의 질문은 여기서 마치는 것으로 하겠습니다. 오늘 강의를 제공해 주신 세 분의 강사진께 감사 인사드리고요. 시간을 초과해서까지 열정적으로 강의해 주셔서 정말 감사드립니다. 한 가지 마지막으로 여쭤보고 싶은 것은 저희 질문이 나왔던 것들 중에 일부 너무 많아서 아직 질문을 못 드린 것이 있는데요. 혹시 이 질문들을 조금 정리해서 이메일로 추가로 문의드릴 수 있을지 궁금합니다.
Sure, we can do that.
네, 감사합니다. 그럼 오랜 시간 수고 많으셨습니다. 강사님들 감사드립니다.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much.
네, 초대해 주셔서 감사드립니다. 감사합니다.
Bye bye.
Bye.